Here in the US, if you look by age group, if you look at people, say, under 30, can anyone tell me how many consume at least one fast food meal a day? And the answer is grotesque. It's 46% of people under 30, at least once a day, are consuming an item that is packaged saturated fats, some awful products that you can't even pronounce, you don't even know what they are or where they came from, an increase in sugars, that is, again, grotesque amount of sugars, and a lack of fiber, a lack of micronutrients, a lack of more plant-based type proteins, which are the healthiest proteins. And so as we age, if you look at people, say 30 to 50, 36% consume a fast food meal a day. And that includes many of our medical colleagues. This has nothing to do with intelligence. This has nothing to do with education. This is about convenience. And we succumb to how easy it is and how cheap it is. And we can discuss the cost of eating a healthy diet versus the cost of eating fast food, which is significant, as we are all aware.
And actually listen to episodes of these shows on podcasts such as Spotify, iTunes, and iHeartRadio. Folks, my name is Dr. Parin Makadia, and I'll be hosting today's show. And we have a very interesting and a very important show today on cardiovascular disease, which, as you know, is the leading cause of death globally, not just in America, but globally. And some statistics, according to CDC, one person dies every 36 seconds from cardiovascular disease. So, joining us today, we have Dr. Federico Macy, who is an interventional cardiologist by training, to discuss the very important topic of cardiovascular medicine. Dr. Macy, welcome to Doc Talk Live. Thank you so much for volunteering your time to be part of this show. Please tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you for that kind invitation, and I'm glad to be here. So I'm Dr. Federico Macy. Some people call me Dr. Macy, and I'm a cardiologist who has been in DFW already for over 20 years. I trained in Houston at the Medical Center at Baylor College of Medicine, and my focus really has been over the last 10 years on preventive cardiovascular disease. And as you correctly mentioned, it is the number one killer worldwide. So it is a priority for our society, for healthcare policy, for our doctors to identify early individuals who may be at risk. And so I'm very excited to expand on this incredibly important topic for our society.
Excellent. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's get right to it. So let's start talking about cardiovascular disease. As we mentioned that it's number one killer globally, but specifically in Western societies. Can you tell our listeners why is that?
Well, very important question. So there's a little bit of a historical background that we have to visit. So starting back, say, in the 1800s, cardiovascular disease existed, of course. People who passed away from heart attacks, strokes, didn't know exactly why. And the incidence at the time was quite low, maybe a person here or there in most Western societies. And we're speaking mostly about European nations. So as the industrialized age came upon us, starting in the late 1700s, but mostly in the 1800s in England, spreading across Europe, and then coming to this continent, to America, the type of industry and the food that came from it, processed foods and foods that weren't as healthy, packaged foods that have spread throughout the world by now, have actually contributed probably the most to increasing the incidence of and the prevalence of atherosclerotic disease worldwide. So food. The quality has gone down, and the quantity that we eat of that food has gone way up. Interestingly enough, I was looking up some statistics not long ago. Every day in the US, we consume 85 million servings of fast food
Very
every
interesting.
single day. 85 million. So, how many of you out there today are guilty of that sinful pleasure? And indeed, unfortunately, we are who we eat, we are what we eat. And unfortunately, once again, the amount of fast food we consume is increasing worldwide. So, if we look at countries like China as a whole, 10, 15 years ago, the incidence of obesity and diabetes or prediabetes, diabetes, hypertension, and cholesterol issues called metabolic syndrome was less than 3% of the population. Now it's starting to reach almost 30%. And what's happened? Well, their number one restaurant is Kentucky Fried Chicken. Kentucky Fried Chicken. So it is clearly indicative that the rest of the world has embraced a fast food consumption nation concept. Here in the US, if you look by age group, if you look at people, say, under 30, can anyone tell me how many consume at least one fast food meal a day? And the answer is grotesque. It's 46% of people under 30, at least once a day, are consuming an item that is packaged saturated fats, some awful products that you can't even pronounce, you don't even know what they are or where they came from, an increase in sugars, that is, again, grotesque amount of sugars, and a lack of fiber, a lack of micronutrients, a lack of more plant-based type proteins, which are the healthiest proteins. And so as we age, if you look at people, say 30 to 50, 36% consume a fast food meal a day. And that includes many of our medical colleagues. This has nothing to do with intelligence. This has nothing to do with education. This is about convenience. And we succumb to how easy it is and how cheap it is. And we can discuss the cost of eating a healthy diet versus the cost of eating fast food, which is significant, as we are all aware.
Absolutely. The cheapest of the food is the unhealthiest of it. A
Correct.
bowl of salad, even at, let's say, hospitals, cafeteria, is more expensive than, I guess, a burger.
Correct. So the issue here is if we visit a little bit more scientifically to what has happened, and I just gave you an overall picture that the food industry developed in the 1950s, packaged foods, TV dinners, things that could be canned. And again, there was a usefulness to some of this during World War II, for example, because food had to go to servicemen, servicewomen in the field, and it had to be sealed so it wouldn't spoil. So there was a rationale for it, but unfortunately, it grew tremendously from the spawning of the fast food restaurant, and we can use McDonald's as an example, and many, many others, that gradually, in the spirit of capitalistic profiteering, made the food less healthy and cheaper to make and much less nutritious, right? So the research as well, unfortunately, starting with Ansel Keys, the lead nutritionist in the United States back in the 40s and 50s, working, I believe, at the University of Minnesota, many times over the years funded by the sugar industry, promoted studies that unfortunately were extremely flawed. One of them was called the 7-country study that looked selectively at countries' diet and determined that fat was the problem and exonerated sugar. And that message, due to his influence, not only in the US but worldwide, caused others to take up the baton of sugar is exonerated and fat is the culprit. And so when President Eisenhower had a heart attack in the early 50s, fat was blamed for it. And of course, the low-fat industry was born. And this was also supported by a doctor named Fred Stair, a nutritionist, who actually was the founder, I believe, of the Harvard Public School of Education and or of preventive medicine. And so that also was funded by the sugar industry, and so fat was deemed to be the problem. And in spite of some lone wolves in England stating that actually sugar was probably also to blame, you know, doing nutrition research is extremely difficult. But what ended up happening, of course, is that the food industry took up the mantle of low fat is the way to go. And if Americans would only eat less red meat, we'll all be fine. And I'm not saying that there wasn't some truth to that. The saturated fats are linked to cardiovascular disease. This indeed is the case, as we know from the Framingham study that started in 1953. And we followed it for the next 30, 40 years and determined the main risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And these were, of course, cholesterol. And at the time, we didn't have a way to measure the different cholesterol particles. So we just took total cholesterol over 200, for example, and high blood pressure and high blood sugar and, of course, smoking. And these were found to be the main risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And to that was added a strong family history of premature cardiovascular disease. So these are the ones that were put forth. Sugar was never mentioned. And so as President Nixon put forth a task force in 1973 to study the way we eat in America, I guess it was McGovern Task Force came up with the original food pyramid of how we should be eating. And he said, yeah, we need to decrease the consumption of fats by about 40%, but sugars too. But that wasn't good for the food industry. So the pyramid got flipped. And in the 80s, we had the worst decade in the history of humanity for nutrition. And the reason was because there were 3 seminal papers put forth by the FDA, by the Surgeon General, and by the American Diabetic Association, all exonerating sugar. In other words, all saying, you can feed a diabetic all the sugar he wants. Not a problem. It's the fat that's the problem. And after 2 studies that were almost neutral, that were done to try to prove that lowering fat with the first statin, you remember Mavacor or to decrease LDL, marginally showed some benefit, marginally, versus people that ate whatever they wanted and that didn't have an elevated, LDL at the beginning, and they did just as well. And another one was a woman's health study for 20 years, so 20,000 nurses mostly, showed almost no difference if they ate a low-fat diet versus whatever they wanted in terms of decreasing cardiovascular events. These are large NIH sponsored trials that were very neutral, and yet the message was fat's the problem. When I trained back in the late 80s and early 90s, that was the message. And I trained with some of the top lipidologists in the country, including Christy Ballantyne, John Farmer, Dr. Gatto, and that was the message. And, we were not even talking about sugar being a problem. So it's only recently in the last decade that the FDA has come around and said, oops, yes, we recognize that our research was flawed, not only in its design, but that we were funded by the sugar industry way back. And now we have come to understand that sugar is a problem. But by this time, the entire world has been indoctrinated on consuming high sugar products. And you and I can go to any grocery store, and if you stay in the middle aisles with all the canned bag goods, 80% have added sugar. If we stick around the sides where there are these things, and some of you might have to Google what these are, they grow on the ground, they're called vegetables. Those are the ones you should be consuming. And those are the ones that you should, ladies, please don't feed your husbands what's in the middle of the grocery store. Just take the gentleman around the corners or the sides, and you're likely to be in a safer spot.
Gentlemen might like it because on one side of the aisles, you tends to be beer and alcohol sometimes.
Yes,
on the far end.
and again, and we can talk about the French paradox as well, and that, because that is also on a bit of shaky ground. It's not exactly Many of the, it's not exactly on solid research data, prospectively, double-blind, placebo-controlled. We don't have that. Nutrition research is very difficult. Low salt, really, 2 grams sodium salt restriction in heart failure. Where is the real data on that? When studies have been done, actually, the better outcomes are in people that consume 4 to 5 or up to 6 grams, no more than 6 per day. And these are, studies with 28,000 patients prospectively followed for over 5 years. Who has more cardiac outcomes, including worsening heart failure, hospitalizations, strokes, and heart attacks, and all-cause mortality, as well as cardiovascular mortality. Multiple endpoints.
So, what do you recommend to your patients when it comes to diet, if you were to put it in 3 or 4 simple bullet points?
Plant-based diets are by far the best. Second, follow the Mediterranean diet. That is the one that has the best data, large meta-analysis with 64 fairly decently designed trials. Again, very difficult to do nutrition trials because they take a long time, 20 years, and no one has the patience for 20 years these days. And so...
What about salt intake?
Salt intake, 4 to 6 grams is the optimal, especially if you live in a humid type environment as we do for half the year. So...
You're not concerned about blood pressure increase or anything that extent?
It's marginal. There is minimal, but if you're following a plant-based diet and a Mediterranean diet, that inherently is going to help you overcome.
Keep you lean.
Yes, keep you leaner and prevent visceral fat and the activation of adipokines that it will increase insulin resistance and send all of the neurohormonal pathways going the wrong way to make your blood vessels stiffer, in other words, less compliant, and to create a pro-atherogenic, in other words, the propensity to create more plaque, and pro-thrombotic, in other words, the propensity to create more blood clots, and more pro-inflammatory. So I think it was Aristotle, he was kind of a famous guy, said, let food be thy medicine. So plant-based is, for me, my favorite. I try to eat plenty of vegetables on a daily basis. Fruit, natural, not in a juice without fiber. I love the fiber. I think berries are great as a dessert. I would do those above, say, a banana that may be more rich in sugar. Average ripe banana has 14 grams of sugar. I myself try not to consume more than 30 to 40 grams of sugar beyond my vegetables. Okay? So that keeps me fairly lean and healthy and cognitively intact. Why? Because with this metabolic syndrome concept of prediabetes, diabetes, hypertension, high triglycerides, low HDL, all combined with visceral obesity, the prevalence is about 25% in the Caucasian population. In the Native American and more indigenous populations like the Mexican American population, 36 to 38% have metabolic syndrome. In African American populations, it's 28%, 30% have metabolic syndrome.
So that was going to be my next question. How are the minorities affected by cardiovascular disease? And you're giving some statistic. Can you elaborate more on it?
So an excellent point again. So we minorities, from different genetic pools throughout the world, have come from more of a hunter-gatherer type genetic background. Our ancestors, way back 10, 20,000 years ago, before the agricultural revolution that occurred sometime around 10,000 years ago, we were hunting. We were eating berries. We were eating nuts. We were eating plants, roots, a few insects here and there. It was rare that we had access to animal meats per se, full of fat and or eggs and or their products, like milk, for example. And so we have our genetics of those years. In the last 200 years, since I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this presentation, the Industrial Revolution has brought to us sugar in small packages ad nauseum and saturated fats in small packages, cheaply packaged in a fast food hamburger concept as a prototype of what we're discussing. We haven't had the time to adapt. We have simply not told our livers, hey, why don't you change and let me eat like some Northern European guy who has been living within the context of an industrialized agricultural community, shoveling sugar and fat all day long every day. Our diets, our people, and the same occurred in places in the Middle East, and the same occur in Asia, India, of course, as part of Asia. All of these countries, they ate much healthier. So you take one of those individuals that has similar genetics as any of us who are minorities, and we take them to eat fast food, 85 million meals a day. Guess what's going to happen in short time? In 10 to 20 years, we're going to have metabolic syndrome, the conglomerate that I mentioned, diabetes, prediabetes, hypertension, cholesterol issues, and obesity. And when that happens, we are promoting 4 bad things. 1, plaque formation in all our arteries, starting with the ones, of course, in the legs first, then coronary carotids concomitantly.
So carotids meaning just for the
in
listeners,
the neck,
to the brain.
in the neck,
That-
one's
that's
going to the
applies
brain.
Yep.
All right. So, and then you form, when the plaque breaks, you form a blood clot. You can have a stroke, a heart attack, and eventually even peripheral arterial disease that goes much undiagnosed today, and that leads to ischemic limb loss, etc. In your field, renal dysfunction, hypertensive nephropathy, diabetic nephropathy, the combination, all of these are tied in to the Western diseases. When England was in Africa and India and places like that, and they took their Western society, processed foods, sugar, soda pop, to the natives. It took them 20 years to become 20, 30, 40% of them diabetics in some of the New Zealand atolls. They became diabetic in 1 generation. Some of the highest prevalence, just like the Pima Indians here in the United States, in the southern states. Why? Genetics.
Right.
They're not used to it. Their liver can't handle it. So the liver takes all of that fat and those sugars and converts them into triglycerides, which become deposited inside the organs, in the visceral areas, and these promote inflammation, coagulation abnormalities, more plaque. And that leads to the dreaded vascular dementia. And since we are on the threshold of increasing the number of people with dementia worldwide, from 50 million diagnosed to over 150 million people with premature dementia, the number 1 cause of dementia, as we all know, is Alzheimer's disease. Second most is cardiovascular. In other words, vascular dementia. And when you combine these two, you have a catastrophe. And more than half of them, or close to, are preventable. And if you have vascular dementia on top of Alzheimer's, you're going to have a more accelerated disease process. So minorities, we are very susceptible to the traditional sad American diet, SAD. We are at high risk for Western diseases, strokes, heart attacks, congestive heart failure, renal failure, peripheral arterial disease with limb loss, all with endothelial dysfunction, all of these resulting in nephropathy, neuropathy, and the dreaded vascular dementia. My biggest fear as a cardiologist, you know what it is?
What?
Not knowing who my children are, or not recognizing my friends or my mom when I'm in my 60s, 70s.
That would be devastating.
It's devastating for any of us. Think about it. You could accept other things. Oh, I broke my leg. I'm in a wheelchair. I can't get around, and I get a little help. I have a crutch. But not being able to read, not being able to talk to your grandchildren, not recognizing them because you have multi-infarct dementia and gradual combination, and we're finding out now more and more that when you have vascular dementia, you accelerate the deposit of beta amyloid. These are complex type proteins that create havoc in our neurons and prevent the neurons from connecting with each other and increase the propensity to form microthrombi. That's a fancy word for saying small blood clots that further impair blood flow to critical brain areas like where your memory center is, where your speech center, your prefrontal cortex, where your cognitive ideas and form, for example. And lastly, tau proteins. These are the ones that we see in Alzheimer's become accelerated. So can you imagine you have a neuron and then you have train tracks, and these train tracks are all twisted like a pretzel. Accelerator of vascular dementia. And so the neurons don't get going. Anyways, overall, cardiovascular disease is the biggest threat to life in the U.S.
So I know we're approaching the end of this episode of Doc Talk Live, and folks, you were just listening to Dr. Macy talk about cardiovascular disease and very robust discussion on this matter. If you were to give our listeners, let's say, bullet point list, 5, let's just take 5. Please give them the bullet point list of what to do in 30 seconds.
Number 1, embrace a plant-based diet. 2, be active every day. Walk 30 minutes. Go play with your kids. Do something physically active. 3, enrich your mind. Stop the video game culture. Read, paint, create. Be a proposer, not just a recipient of ideas. Number 4, spend time with family. This decreases stress in most cases. Spend time with friends. This decreases stress. Tell them you love them. Tell them how important they are to you. And lastly, go out of your way to help somebody without them asking. Just do it.
Excellent.
And you will do amazing for yourself.
Those are great value points to take home with. Folks, you are listening to Doc Talk Live, and this is Dr. Macadia signing off. Stay healthy, America.